The entire world is engulfed one way or another in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, from brands grappling with whether to withdraw operations from Russia to TikTok influencers leveraging their popularity to battle propaganda and misinformation. We'll talk about all of this on today's edition of For Immediate Release, the Hobson and Holtz Report. Also in this month's episode, Neville has an update on the UK's online safety bill. The PR world is outraged by the revelation that a well-known agency founder and CEO has been engaged in unethical activity, but what to do about it remains a mystery. Accenture lists 4 key tech trends for 2022, and Clubhouse may have ushered in the era of social audio, but it sure doesn't look like it'll be one of the platforms most people will turn to for their social listening pleasure. Dan York's Tech Report dives into some Twitter updates, Facebook and Instagram news, and website accessibility. All that and more is coming your way right now on For Immediate Release. Another fine podcast from the FIR Podcast Network.
This is For Immediate Release, the podcast for communicators.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the monthly edition of For Immediate Release, episode number 238 for Monday, March the 21st, 2022. This is Neville Hobson.
And I'm Shel Holtz. Glad you're all here. You know, I really enjoy those short episodes that we have been doing in between the monthly Hobson and Holtz reports, but I look forward to these. I look forward to these long conversations. I enjoy the depth, and I enjoy the longer talk with you, Neville.
Yeah, those other ones are great to show that we actually can do short episodes, difficult though it is. It's much more difficult than a 90-minute one, I tell you. But I agree. We can explore things in more depth. Although I think the balance is terrific, having the less than 15-minute episodes and then the longer monthly one. That's a good mixture.
And we have a number of topics that looking forward to discussing here today. Before we do that, though, I want to let everyone know that the latest episode of Circle of Fellows has been posted. This is the monthly live-streamed conversation that I moderate with usually 4 IABC fellows. That's how many we had this time around. The topic was engaging stakeholders with strategic communication. And as Brad Whitworth, one of the panelists, said, you got 2 loaded words right there, engaging and stakeholders, or stakeholder engagement. So we dug into that and the various ways to approach this and the traps and risks and the like. In addition to Brad, Letitia Narvaez, George McGrath, and Martha Muzichka were the panelists. It was a terrific conversation, and the recording is now up on the FIR Podcast Network. Go ahead and give it a listen. If you like what you hear, subscribe so you don't miss any of these. IABC fellows tend to be fairly knowledgeable, so the conversations get pretty deep and pretty good.
Excellent. So we mentioned the short FIR episodes, and in fact, since the last monthly show in February, about a month ago from now, we've recorded 10. It wasn't until I was looking at the list that I realized we actually recorded 10 of these things. Each of these is under 15 minutes, well under in the case of the FIR Podcast Network episode, closer to 15 if you listen to the edition on the Marketing Podcast Network. But 10 varying topics, just to give you a sense of what they were if you haven't listened to any of them. There's been some really interesting topics that we could have, it would have been interesting if we had spent more on some of them, but they were designed for the short form discussion. So they're just single topics in these episodes. The first one we did after the last monthly was about rethinking silos. That was in episode 228. Research finds communication intensified as workers went remote. Again, a talk about working from home and hybrid working. A bit further up, episode 230, employees versus NFTs. That was related to the employee revolt at Salesforce. against their plans to enter the NFT market. A letter and lots of discussion internally there. We talked about decentralized branding in episode 232, how DAOs could create visual identities. And that's an acronym, or an initialism, I should say, that you're going to see more of if you're wondering what it is. And then more recently, we did 234, You're Always on the Record. PR practitioners need to stop making up rules. That was interesting. Some of the media are getting a bit impatient with the way in which PR is practiced by some practitioners in terms of assuming something when they tell you something's embargoed that you haven't agreed to. It just comes out of the blue. That was actually a good discussion, that one. And then the latest one we did just a few days ago, 237, Are NFTs the new social layer? That's a really interesting topic to me, frankly, because that stems from Mark Zuckerberg talking about you're going to find NFTs on Instagram pretty soon. And so we talked about that because it goes a bit beyond that, actually. The new social layer is that thing about verification of identity and stuff like that. Could it? We don't know. We talked about it in that episode. So that's a sampling of 10 shorts, FIR shorts, as I call them, short form episodes that you can listen to in addition to this monthly, and you will find them all in your RSS feed.
And if you stick with us for a while today, you'll hear Dan York's report, and he's also going to offer his perspective on Instagram's inevitable offering of something to do with NFTs. We'll have to wait and see what that is.
So we've talked about Ukraine a little bit in some of these short form episodes. And I think I'm right, Shell. When we recorded, I am right, actually. When we recorded the February episode, that invasion of Ukraine had not happened yet, because that happened on the 24th of February. So lots happened since this last episode. From our perspective as communicators, what's happening in Ukraine, the sanctions against Russians, and then all the stuff that's been going on about brands and other big organizations typically shutting down their operations in Russia, pulling out of Russia. Many are. It's in the I think it's more than 500 organizations now of record. A handful aren't, and that's causing some controversial reaction. So all that's been going on in the midst of a truly awful thing that's happening in Ukraine. The humanitarian suffering, the destruction of that country is truly, truly awful. You can't avoid it from TV news and online even. So we're going to talk a bit about that from a communication perspective. And on that topic of brands in particular, there's two surveys I want to reference, because this is actually pretty interesting. One of the shorts we talked about, Shell, was precisely on this topic, where we talked about should a brand pull out of Russia? And my view on that was it's kind of an it depends. And you didn't agree with that at all. In fact, you're right. Sooner or later, I think we're in agreement on this, that everyone doing business with Russia is going to have to stop it. And there's no two ways about it, no ifs or buts. And so there's some evidence to show that if you are a brand and you're not pulling out, you will suffer serious damage, according to surveys of people who have said that. So 2 YouGov surveys were published in early March. The research was done in early March, they were published in mid-March, so it's pretty recent. The first one, again, interesting. We've paid attention to this, so there's no surprises here, but generally speaking, there might be some surprise. But 2/3 of the public, this is a survey done in the UK, 2/3 of the public say brands should take a stance on Ukraine. They should have a position about Ukraine. So new data from YouGov shows that 2 in 3 people in the UK, at 68%, say it's important that brands publicly take a stand on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Fewer than 1 in 5, 17%, disagree with that. 3/4 of the public think companies should stop doing business in Russia entirely. That's 76%, versus 6% who don't agree with that. And the same proportion say they should donate money and supplies to humanitarian efforts in Ukraine, 77% versus 4%. 3 in 5 Britons say they would have a better opinion of a brand that stopped doing business in Russia, 62% said that, or offered humanitarian support to Ukraine, 61% said that. Taking this even further, half of the public say they are more likely to buy from a brand that pledges income to Ukraine, 51%, just over half, or promises money and supplies to humanitarian efforts, 50%. The same proportion would reward a business that stops operating in Russia, 51%. The survey results that YouGov published, I didn't see anything on defining what that would look like, but interesting that this is the responses from people. 2 in 5 of those surveyed, that's 41%, say they have either already boycotted or would consider boycotting a brand that continues doing business in the invading country, while 1 in 5, or 20%, say they would stop buying from a company that has not pledged any support for or made any public statements about Ukraine. Now, there's another survey I'm going to reference in a minute, but before I do that, what are your thoughts about this, Shell? This is UK. I think you can extrapolate this out to many other countries too. These sentiments reflected in this survey, I'm not surprised at any of it. That is an overwhelming statement here from people that if you're doing this there, we're not going to buy your products, is essentially what people are saying.
Yeah, the only mild surprise that I'm experiencing here is that it's not wider margins, that there is a percentage that, I won't boycott.
Yeah. Tiny percentages.
Tiny percentage, but it doesn't surprise me. I think people are outraged. I think there has been an excellent job on the part of governments and media to portray exactly what's happening there. Zelensky himself, the president of Ukraine, has done a good job of appealing to people to do something. And I think that has created this sense that people have that I really should do something to help these people. So when they're asked, they're inclined to say, yeah, I would definitely take a position against a company that has not decided to leave Russia or to aid Ukraine, which makes it a pretty easy decision for a lot of organizations, and yet a lot of organizations haven't. In particular, there are organizations that have not stopped doing business in Russia. Koch Industries, which is involved in fossil fuels, is kind of notoriously thumbing its nose at the idea of stopping its operations in Russia. Then you have some consumer product companies. I shared a graphic I saw on Facebook that listed all of the brands that Nestle owns and said, stop doing business with these companies because Nestle has not stopped doing business in Russia. And I shared that on Facebook, just click the share button. And one of the responses I got from a friend was, well, what about Procter & Gamble? What about, and listed some other consumer product companies that evidently haven't left. So there are some that clearly think that they, for one reason or another, and I'm going to assume that profit is the primary reason, not to leave Russia, and they think they can withstand the wrath of their customers or won't incur any, and that justifies their ability to stay there and continue to service that market and earn those profits.
I think that's the key thing. There's not much communication from some of those companies, and there's a vacuum, so everyone else is piling in with we think it's because of X. I see a lot of that with some of these companies. The second survey actually it kind of speaks to this point. So the second YouGov survey, what is motivating companies to ditch Russia is the kind of title of their report. It starts by talking about how people here in the UK tend to think that companies are motivated by public relations or profit. Your point about profit. This includes 31% of those surveyed who think these companies are ending operations in Russia to maintain a positive public image, and 20% who say they're more interested in dodging future sanctions. Only a third of those surveyed, that's 34%, think companies choosing to cease trading in Russia are doing so as a sincere reaction to the war. So only a third of those surveyed stated that belief.
Well, what's interesting about that is if you were to give a list of, say, 20 companies that have left Russia and say, for this one, why do you think they left? For this one, why do you think they left? It might be different. You might see that people who know that company X has long stood by their values and they have exhibited these kinds of behaviors in the past, And people might say, oh, yeah, they did it because it's their values and they believe in this. Whereas this company, which waited 3 weeks and was the subject of calls for boycott before they left, yeah, they did it for public relations and perception purposes. So, yeah, these surveys, there are some issues with those kinds of blanket results.
So the demographics or the generational split is interesting too. I mean, the younger you are, the more skeptical you are as to the reasons behind businesses cutting ties with Russia. So if you're in the 18 to 24 age range, that's Gen Z, if I'm not wrong, trying to maintain a positive public image for themselves resonated with 38% of those surveyed, but only with 22% of people 65 and older, i.e. the boomers. Kind of in the middle, protecting themselves from potential sanctions, only 17% of the younger generation felt that was the case, 24% against the older ones. And the final split, making a statement against the war, 20% of the youngest generation felt that was the reason, but 45% of the older generation felt that was the reason. So some interesting metrics. It kind of fits with an event I took part in last Monday. It's the 15th of March, last Tuesday, I should say, the 15th of March in London, where at the Global Soft Power Summit that took place. This was a conference looking at, well, soft power as opposed to hard power. It's like influencer power, if you will. So impressive speakers at the conference itself, a handful, I think 3 or 4, maybe 4 ex-prime ministers from European countries. There was a keynote speaker, Ban Ki-moon, who was the 8th Secretary General of the United Nations, and Hillary Clinton was one of the keynotes, former US Secretary of State. In our area of strong interest, Martin Sorrell was a speaker, he of ex-WPP, embroiled in a bit of a scandal in recent years with his agency and is now off doing something entirely different, but a very influential voice. He was a keynote speaker. And a whole handful of people prominent here in the UK in the media and in politics were speakers. There were a series of workshops, of which the one I'm going to talk about a little is one I was part of, about brand solidarity with Ukraine. That was the broad topic of it. And it was organized by Marcel Nobil, who founded Superbrands, amongst other organizations. He did a great job in assembling a pretty good speaker panel. Obviously, myself, I was one of them, but there was also Felix Henderson, the co-founder of a branding agency called Look After Group, Sophie Devonshire, an author and CEO of the Marketing Society, and Marina Persenti, who's a member of the Ukrainian Institute Supervisory Board based in London. So she had a very authentic voice to talk about Ukraine from her perspective as a Ukrainian, but also in the Ukrainian Institute. So the topic was on how brands can best support Ukraine. How can we do that and contribute to the push for peace was the strapline of that discussion. It actually produced some pretty vibrant reasons and discourse amongst the panel in the 45-minute session we had, and a handful of questions at the end that were quite interesting. But I guess the bottom line is that everyone agreed that we had to do something and we can do something. I've talked to a handful of people who say, well, I don't know what to do. What could I do other than donate? There's actually lots you could do from a communications point of view. A common theme all the panelists, including me, talked about was storytelling. Putting it simply, tell stories that you encounter that resonate, amplify other people's stories. These are some of the simple things that you can do. Marcel has published a list on the website that includes the stuff we talked about in the panel, but a longer list of other things that brands can do and individuals can do. Fundraising here and there. One of my favorites that I talked about was how organizations can mobilize their employees to support what the organization is doing, talk about it, run workshops, connect with people if you've got operations in outside of your home country, if you're a multinational company. What if, a question I asked, what if you're a small brand? Because much of the discussion and ideas are attuned to large brands, people, organizations with hundreds, if not thousands of employees operating in more than one country. Not everyone's like that. What if you're a small brand? You've got 15 or 20 employees, even less perhaps, but you've got a logo, you've got a product, and you're doing well in your market. How can you support something like this? You have a view. How can you do that? You can do what the big brands do, maybe not the same scale. You can tell stories. You can amplify someone else's message. You could run a webinar. You could talk about your own personal perspective, write a blog post or Facebook or LinkedIn post or something like that. And there's lots more that people can do. Individuals, similar things, amplify messages. You don't necessarily need to get into huge debates or discussions, but you can certainly amplify. There's lots of things to see, which of course led us, all of us, to actually talk about the mindfulness and dangers of amplifying misinformation, disinformation. There's a huge amount of that. All the media companies in the UK, and I'm certain many in the US too, and most other countries, have published guidelines how to verify video in particular. You see, how do you verify reports you see online about things? And not everything you're going to be able to guarantee is kosher, let's say. And there will be times where you will amplify something and it is fake. But these are some of the things that came up. And I think the sentiment at the end of it was very positive, in the sense of, yes, there are things all of us can do. Each of us can do individually. Each of us can do as representatives of a brand, either an employee, a company owner, an agency working with clients in areas. You can do something that is relevant, that is effective. And the overriding thing, and of course, here's the fine line for brands, is that they must resonate with your brand values. But it's not a marketing message. This is selfless communication. This is something that you need to do with a mind on authenticity, and don't kind of wrap it up with a brand message. So, as I said in my kind of with a nod and a wink, don't let the marketing people craft the message. This needs to be authentic. This is not a brochure. This is not time for marketing. So it was a good experience to be there. I'm very glad Marcel invited me to be on that panel. All of the panelists were smart people. We had a lot of ideas being shared. And if you think about this was all planned real fast. This didn't take weeks to prepare for this. It was planned quite quickly. And the audience too, some smart questions from people. I've seen some media reports about it too, talking about it. So it's getting some attention. And being part of this emerging topic of soft power. I mean, I've heard of it. I'm aware of it. I've not really paid much attention to it. I think that's going to assume much greater importance in the coming, years, sure. But immediately in the context of Ukraine and Russia, maybe this is something that parallels all the stuff that's going on that you hear about, formal talks, the saber rattling going on between politicians and all that. In the meantime, there's conversations, there's discussion happening look at something we were talking about before we started recording, Arnold Schwarzenegger's video, for instance. We need more people doing stuff like that. And the TikTok, which you're going to talk about a bit later at the White House, and the influencers and all that. So more of that can help in this specific context. So there's lots of other ideas will emerge from this, I'm sure. But I like to think that we made a contribution to the overall conversation here.
Sounds like you did. I can tell you where I work, we have a partner company that is headquartered in eastern Ukraine. So we've been reporting on how they're doing. We included in that photos of a couple of our people who went over there a couple of years ago, and showing happy Ukrainian employees of this organization in this beautiful city with these beautiful backdrops. And talking about the fact that they've had to disperse. Several have gone to Poland. Some have gone to Western Ukraine. A couple are staying at the headquarters office in Eastern Ukraine and trying to tough it out. Shortly after that, one of our people launched a GoFundMe to help those employees and their families. And the company decided to match employee contributions up to $5,000. So we have this ongoing conversation going on about this organization that we are directly connected to. And I think personalizing it that way also makes people more interested, and possibly leads them to look for more information and more ways to help. We have also published a list of charities with the links that have been vetted as authentic that people can donate to in order to provide humanitarian effort at a larger scale. So, yeah, absolutely. A lot that organizations and individuals can do. And I think organizations partnering with their employees is actually a good approach to take on this. No worrying about marketing messages when you're communicating this internally instead of externally.
Yeah. So I think what you just mentioned is interesting. I know of a number of companies who are doing that, i.e., matching donations, connecting with employees in companies if they have an operation in Ukraine or elsewhere. Things are looking pretty dire in Ukraine. If you just look at the TV news today, for instance, this town Mariupol in the south. Even Kyiv is under siege, literally, it seems to me, from some of the news reports with missile strikes in the north of that city. The Russians seem to be hell-bent on utter destruction of this country. So think of the picture you've seen of Syria in recent years. That's what they want this to look like. And indeed, Mariupol, from some drone footage that was on TV news at lunchtime today, is looking a lot like that. So it's actually hard in many ways to equate some scenes and what you hear. I have friends who live in Kyiv and in Kharkiv in the east, which is also being leveled by the Russians, that trying to do business as normal. And you see some scenes in parts of Lviv in the western part of Ukraine where the buses are running, the trains are running, trams are running, people are shopping. And in the background, in the far distance, you can see smoke rising from missile strikes at the airport and things like that. So it's surreal. Nevertheless, people are dying, and it's dire. It's terrible what's happening. So on the focus of brands, one of the audience members, one of the participants on the panel, I should say, mentioned Unilever as a good example, and some of the activism that's taking place to protest against Unilever, saying literally that they have an important role to play in the society in Russia by providing valuable consumer goods to them, like Dove soap. That's their reason for staying there. I mean, I'm maybe taking that totally out of context, but that's how it was talked. So someone else mentioned Pfizer, and I've forgotten the other pharmaceutical company, are not pulling out at all because they manufacture drugs, and they've been there many, many, many years. They have a manufacturing facility. They're manufacturing medicines that the local population needs. And that's a tricky one. That is a very tricky one, I think. Some people say, and they did, doesn't matter, you got to pull out. I don't believe it's as straightforward as that in that particular case. So I'd hate to be the one having to make that decision, I must say. So there's all sorts of things to think about in this regard. In the meantime, things don't seem to be getting any better there, and all the help we can do. There's now 2 million people have vacated Ukraine, by the way. Most of them gone to Poland. And there's issues there in Poland. So from the communication point of view, we continue doing the stories. We continue amplifying things. We continue doing things like you've said, Shell, what your company's doing, what others I hear are doing too. We continue doing that. And I believe the cumulative effect of that, and if Arnie does another video, if other celebs do videos or do messages like that. And indeed, one of the ideas discussed in the panel was, if you're a brand and you've been already building up influencer networks, then that you call upon your influencers now. This is something you want to have an ask of them to get involved in too. So lots to do. And we're seeing more ideas all the time. I just pray, frankly, that things don't go really awful and we run out of time for all these things.
One thing that we haven't heard about is employee activism. I'm thinking of Unilever in particular, or Nestle. I haven't heard about employees taking action. I know that when Disney continued to make political donations to politicians in Florida who had supported the Don't Say Gay bill, employees walked off the job. I mean, employees organized, and I don't know for a fact that it was this as opposed to calls to boycott Disney parks and other things. It was probably cumulative that led Disney to back off and say, okay, we're going to stop making donations in Florida altogether to politicians. But it certainly didn't hurt for employees to raise their voices. So just one other consideration here. Now let's stick with the Russian invasion of Ukraine for a few more minutes. A couple stories that both have pretty profound implications for communications that go beyond this conflict. The first one, a video appeared on Facebook and YouTube and Telegram and VKontakte, which is the Russian social network, the Russian Facebook, in which Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, asked the Ukrainian troops to lay down their weapons. Essentially, it's done, we're surrendering. In this clip, he looked fairly stiff and his tone of voice was kind of off. At the same time this was released, hackers defaced the website of a Ukraine TV station, inserting a still of that video and a summary of the statement that scrolled across the screen on the Chiron. Within minutes of that hack, Zelensky posted a Facebook video denying that was him, denying that he was asking Ukrainians to surrender, and calling it a childish provocation. The video was a deepfake, an artificial intelligence-produced bit of fakery that purported to be him but was not. Twitter and Facebook removed it based on its violating their policies. Twitter said they were tracking it, and YouTube removed it, and all of this happened pretty quickly. But it stands as the first weaponized use of a deepfake during an armed conflict. Now, one of the ways that Zelensky was able to deal with this so quickly is that he had a Facebook profile, and he had used that and a couple of other channels to warn the world that he had intelligence that there were deep fakes coming. So when this deep fake happened, he was able to get out there pretty quickly and basically say, this is what I warned you about, which led the organizations whose platforms played host to these videos to be able to deal with them pretty fast. So, there's a lesson here about dealing with deepfakes, which could be coming for other political leaders and business leaders. If you know that you are likely to be a deepfake target, get the word out, prepare people for that, and when it hits, respond quickly with a denial, preferably on video, preferably the person who was the subject of the deepfake making the statement, him or herself, saying, no, that wasn't me, this was a deepfake, I warned you that this was coming, and that can accelerate the way that the social media platforms deal with this and the way the media gets the word out that this was not for real. The second item of interest to communicators, which you mentioned, Neville, is how the White House recruited TikTok influencers to help deliver its messages about the war in Ukraine. Now, it's interesting that Saturday Night Live's Cold Open a week ago made fun of this, but it was actually a pretty serious and effective effort. On March 10th, 30 TikTok stars got together on Zoom to get a briefing on the government's strategic goals and to answer their questions on a variety of themes like distribution of aid to Ukrainians, working with NATO, and how the U.S. might react to the prospect of a Russian nuclear strike. Now, TikTok has been an important source of information on what's happening in Ukraine, and it delivers the information in pretty close to real time. Ukrainians in various situations have used TikTok to share their stories, while Russia, of course, is spreading disinformation and propaganda on the platform. Now, as for these TikTok stars, a lot of them have been trying to make sense of the crisis for their audience. This is according to an article that appeared in the Washington Post. So the U.S. presidential administration started working with a nonprofit advocacy group called Gen Z for Change to identify the top TikTok creators who might be influential in this situation, those who have been out there trying to analyze it and discuss it with their audiences. And these are the ones who were invited to the briefing. One of these is a 21-year-old named Khalil Green. He said he wasn't surprised to get the invitation. He wrote, "People in my generation get all our information from TikTok. It's the first place we're searching up new topics and learning about new things." I just heard from someone at work, by the way, that TikTok has become a primary source of news for people in that Gen Z demographic. One of the things the administration asked of these creators was to help stop the spread of propaganda and misinformation. That left several influencers feeling empowered to take up the challenge. It only took a couple hours after that briefing ended before they started blasting out messages to their millions of followers. One of them, just one video from one of those influencers, He posted a video about what he took away from the briefing, and that one video had been viewed more than 300,000 times, and that was when the Post wrote the articles, probably much more since then. So there are a few obvious lessons here, starting with recognizing TikTok's value, then knowing when to reach out to the right set of creators, influencers, to help spread a message they are likely to want to help spread. This won't be messages about how much cleaner your laundry detergent will get clothes, but for organizations dealing with public policy, maybe those in the nonprofit world, for example, this can be a potent group of people to call on for help.
Yeah, exactly. And indeed, this is precisely the point that was discussed in the panel at the conference I mentioned last week on if you have an influencer network, this is the time to call in all the favors you've got or to actually plan with them a program to support this or to call on them to support you. So it's interesting, isn't it? This kind of thing. I've heard anecdotal comment mostly in the mainstream media, I have to say, about the calling this the TikTok war. Not because of this, but because the footage of this is appearing on various TikTok channels. So it could also be the broader social media war, the Twitter war, if you like. I mean, it is interesting adding this into the fact that this is a real-time online war, as well as a horribly real war with bullets and bombs falling everywhere and actually killing people. People aren't seeing it as like a surreal video game where you're hearing about death and destruction, and then you're seeing everywhere you look online, as well as the traditional media. You're seeing it in your Twitter feed. There's even Twitter handles set up to do. You can subscribe and follow all sorts of things on Twitter, Facebook too. I've seen it, LinkedIn even. So it's all over the place, and now we're seeing it in the very social side of the social web. It's in itself, this is probably a milestone event, I would say. There's not been anything like this before. I think that's right, wouldn't you say?
I would say, yes, that is correct. I mean, there have been conflicts.
Not like this.
Where social media was a factor, but this is the first all-out
global
war where social media is being employed by both sides strategically.
Anyone with a Twitter handle could join the war, basically.
In a sense, yes. Not quite the same as taking up arms and facing the enemy.
No, not quite. But hey, the pen is mightier than the sword, no?
We all have a part to play.
Yeah. So just shifting focus slightly, in last month's episode in February, we talked about the online safety bill. That's a piece of legislation doing the rounds in the bill stage in Parliament here in the UK that aims to make the internet safer for users, hold tech companies to account, protect children from harmful content such as pornography, and limit users' exposure to illegal content while protecting freedom of speech. No small task, therefore, I hear you say, but maybe not. It's gone through a number of drafts. There's been lots of discussion since it was introduced to Parliament for debate last December. The draft, as it was first created, was published in May of last year, and it's been tweaked and changed and so forth as we discussed. A further version was presented to Parliament just a few days ago with some additions. That has got, I guess, everyone with an opinion out on board online everywhere with those opinions. And boy, is there disagreement there everywhere. So will this world first, as even the government is describing it, the world's first online safety bill with real teeth, send ripples across a pond? Or is it going to be a genuine tsunami that will make wholesale change in those important areas the bill is designed to address in terms of protections and rights and responsibilities of people with those rights? It's a question mark, and no one can give a definitive answer to that. We've just got opinions right now. There's lots of them. Many good ones, I would hasten to add. One good one I found pretty quickly was written by Drew Benvey. He's the founder of the Battenall Agency here in the UK. That he says forcing platforms to better police themselves is only half the battle. And that's in response to one of the aspects of the role of the regulator here, Ofcom is the acronym, they'll have the power to fine companies up to 10% of their annual global turnover for failure to comply with the law and force them to improve their practices and block non-compliant sites. Does that sound a bit familiar to GDPR when we heard that coming out? They're going to fine all these companies X% of their global revenue. This, though, is I think, a little different to that. The intent, or rather the intention and desire to implement this is very strong. There's more to it, though, because not only is it there that the legislation would empower the authorities, i.e. the government and the regulator in this country, to prosecute the executives of offending companies if they do not do what the regulator has instructed them to do. And after a certain period of time, there could be an arrest warrant issued for Mark Zuckerberg, for instance, or probably Nick Clegg, somebody. I think the proof will be in the test when that happens, whether this is actually going to make any difference to anything. I also believe that most reasonable people involved in this genuinely want to have something that works for everyone, and therein potentially, I think, lies the difficulty with it. The new bill describes measures that it suggests will reduce harmful content online, one of which is about identity verification. The suggestion is that all social networks should be able to verify a user's real identity, and if a user so desires, it can automatically block all non-verified accounts in order to reduce exposure to trolling. Drew likes that, he says, and can see its value, especially for big social media profiles such as footballers or politicians, as much as for the average person. It'll be a major feature for all social networks to develop and standardize, but it could work for preventing many cases of trolling. But the reality of protecting social media users from attacks is that the sheer volume of the attacks themselves and the methods deployed by attackers to cover their tracks makes detection hard and protection even harder. The real dilemma, though, according to Sky News in their report, is that even after years of debate, there remain substantive differences of opinion about the nature and purpose of the bill, let alone what it will achieve when it finally becomes law. The Online Rights Group, as a UK-based digital campaigning organisation, has plainer talk about the online safety bill. They say it is a festival of inane, poorly thought out and dangerous ideas. Longer term, it will be fuel for the Putins and the other authoritarians who revel in the prospect of identifying everyone and deciding for themselves what's right and wrong, and will be very pleased that the UK government is taking essentially the same approach. That's their view. So the whole kaleidoscope of opinion is out there. It's a work in progress, basically, is how it looks to me. I think there's some in government who are walking dangerously close to that precipice edge, that you fall over that and you're into the realm of censorship. There are some things in here that I find a little disturbing, but I'm giving a benefit of the doubt from my own point of view, or my own belief, if you like, that they're doing this with the best intent. It will not be perfect when it first comes out. So, as I say, it's a work in progress, but I believe this will become law during 2022 in whatever form it is at when that decree is passed in Parliament. So it's a work in progress, and we shall see it hopefully improving in the coming year. But I agree from what I've read, and the government is saying, this is the first legislation of its type in any country in the world. One reason I suspect why it's getting huge attention internationally. I just hope it does make it into law and doesn't get sandwiched between all the vested interests with their different opinions who want to have this added and this taken away, and no one can agree on exactly what. Such is the life of trying to get a bill through Parliament or your legislative assembly in whatever country you are. This is how it works, right? I think it will become law, though, Shel.
Well, I'll assume positive intent. Obviously, they're trying to solve some really natty problems here. I'm skeptical that we will, regardless of how the legislation shakes out, will ever see Mark Zuckerberg in prison, wearing an orange jumpsuit. I question whether the State Department would take seriously an extradition request.
So they go for Nick Clegg then. He's a Brit.
There you go. They can get him without having to ask anything.
The
of the
number
State
3
Department.
guy. Yeah, the number 3 guy. Yeah.
Right. The big social media companies have been asking for regulation. Their whole argument has been, look, there's a lot to deal with here, and if we knew what the rules were, we could focus our efforts and our research and our investments on addressing these things. But when you leave it to us, each of us are going to approach it differently, and we might not approach the right stuff. It seems like a lame excuse. They know what the problems are. They could tackle these if they wanted to invest enough time and resources and money and take enough of a hit on advertising and the like. I do believe that regulation is going to be necessary, but like most legislation that we see, and in this case, I think it panders to what the loudest voices are screaming about rather than offering a considered approach to addressing the real issues. I like the trolling concept here, but I don't think putting the executives of these organizations in prison or threatening to do that is going to solve any problems. We need to get down into the technical levels of what's going on, and that's where the regulation has to happen. It's boring, and it doesn't get people riled up, and it doesn't send people to the polls to vote for the people who are promoting this, but it's what will solve the problem, and that, I worry, is a long way off if we're ever going to see it at all.
Yeah, I think you're being a little too generous with the tech companies. I think this kind of threat is needed. In the case of Facebook, in particular, there's lots they could have done, and they never did, and they've been delaying action with all sorts of excuses. Cambridge Analytica was probably the milestone moment, and the lies and cover-ups and the simple misbehavior that went on. So I think the threat is good to have, and if it turns out they never will use it, even better, because they will step up to the plate and do what they're supposed to do. So I think it.
I'm not opposed. I'm not opposed to the threat, but the threat has to be tied to something specific.
Well, sure it is. I mean, if you look at the draft, it's very clear in there what the threat's tied to. So there is a specific in there.
Right, but I'm not sure that specific is going to result in the kind of action. It has to provide a roadmap for what it is that we're going to fix.
You're right. Again, it's like one of the whatever X number of things that are, but it doesn't explain this too well, or someone will say, yes, it does. So there is no agreement other than the broad concept of this. So the fine idea, if you're told you're going to get fined and you need to do X, Y, and Z, and you haven't done it within 2 months, you will potentially be prosecuted. So it's going to be written into law. And I agree. Some of the criticisms of that are very squarely in the areas of civil liberties and privacy and so forth. I get it. Truly, I do. But I also get the consequences of actions of Facebook at the time of Cambridge Analytica. And that was absolutely inexcusable what they did. And there's rumblings and rumors and you name it ever since that they're still doing it. Are they? I don't know, but they say they're not. But look at the waste of time dragging Zuckerberg and others through the US Congress and all those meetings with senators that went on. On the one hand, as I saw it from when I watched them, I thought these senators had absolutely no idea how this stuff works. Well, and there's Zuckerberg running circles around them all because with his non-answers to everything. So if this kind of stops that kind of behavior, that's good. But the threat is there.
And that's the question. I mean, if the politicians who are drafting the legislation don't understand the technology, is the legislation going to adequately or appropriately focus on the things that these technology-based companies need to do? And that's where I'm skeptical.
They've got the benefit of the wisdom of the crowd telling them what to put in the draft for the next amendment. And
the crowd is who's loud and upset, not necessarily who's smart about the way these things work.
That's how it works, as you know. Look at history. So this is not going to be perfect. Absolutely,
I'm not going to argue with you about that's the way it works. I'm just saying that that's going to prevent this from being a really workable solution that produces the kind of outcomes that everybody's hoping it will.
Fine. It may take another 2 iterations of the draft or the actual law itself when it's made legal.
Well, by that time, Web 3 will be out and everything else will have changed.
And Zuckerberg won't be so influenced. He may well be in jail by then. But I mean, it's not perfect. It's going to make a difference, I think, in many regards if it enables some of these big issues to be addressed that clearly have not been addressed by the tech companies on their own. And you mentioned that they've been clamoring for regulation. I don't see it that way. They've only been doing that because it's kind of like, well, actually, we better say this because this is going to come anyway. So let's look as if it's our idea. That's not the case at all. So, so it's a big topic, no question. So I think, notwithstanding all of that, perfection is not here at all. There will be more change, but I do believe it will become part of law in the UK.
On that, I agree with you.
Before the end of 2022, I think.
Greetings, Shall and Neville, and FIR listeners all around the world. It's Dan York coming at you from Shelburne, Vermont. And I have to admit, this month's report's been a bit hard to put together because the stuff I usually talk about seems rather trivial in comparison to what's happening in the Ukraine right now. And so my heart goes out to any of our listeners who are there. I hope that you are safe. I hope that we can emerge out of this invasion soon. I hope things can get to a place where you are okay in all of this. It's been a crazy week at my employer, the Internet Society, as we've kind of watched these past couple of weeks what's happening, trying to understand what's going on with the Internet, both in Ukraine, where heroically a group of people have been keeping it up, keeping it going, despite the attacks, despite the wiping out of infrastructure. They've been keeping the Internet alive so that people can be able to get information out and get information in. And that's amazing what's been happening there. What's a bit more concerning, though, is kind of what's happening with Russia, because for several years, President Putin has wanted to disconnect Russia from the rest of the global internet. He's wanted to make it into, or he's seemed to want to make it into, a surveillance state like China, where the government controls all the modes of information, everything else. And in the early days of the invasion, we were seeing protesters live streaming at great personal risk out of various places in Russia. We saw youth taking to TikTok and Instagram talking about, what was going on. We saw sharing of information. But what's been happening, of course, is that the Russian government has been trying to block all of that. And then some of the organizations and companies on the outside have been choosing to disconnect from Russia. And unfortunately, the unintended consequence of that is that we're blocking a bit of the free flow of information to the Russian citizens, to the people who might resist, to the people who are doing this kind of thing. And this is concerning because this is actually what Putin has wanted, to be disconnected into a controlled authoritarian space. We need to figure out how to get more internet into Russia, not less, so that, yes, we want to block the propaganda and the disinformation, misinformation, but we want to make sure information is getting to the people inside, which is hard to do right now. So it's a super concerning point of view, in part also because authoritarian regimes around the world are looking at this and saying, how could we disconnect from the rest of the world because we want our little safe space where we control everything? I don't know. It's a crazy time, and I cannot think otherwise, or think anything else except that I wish the best for all of our folks who are in that space right now, and this is going to have ramifications for a long time, I think, for the internet and for everything else. Moving from that into those more trivial things that we talk about, this past month saw a movement within Twitter on a couple of things. One interesting, on Spaces, the Twitter Spaces, they're now testing out clipping, where you could take a clip of a Twitter space and post it out to your timeline or other spaces and share that. It's only available to a few people, but something to pay attention to and watch. We also saw this past month, if you weren't paying attention to it in the iOS side, there was the Twitter tries once again to make its timeline interesting, and they tried to do the latest tweets, but they put it on a separate tab. They backed away from that. They did other different things, but Twitter's still trying to figure out what to do there. Speaking of Twitter, there was a really interesting New York Times article as well back on March 2nd talking about Twitter's intentions to kind of decentralize and reinvent itself, the Blue Sky Initiative. Nothing for people to think about now, but something just to keep on your radar that Twitter is trying to do. And I'd encourage you to take a look at that. Shifting to Facebook and Meta, Facebook did something some of you may have been bit by, I was, where they launched this thing called Facebook Protect, where you suddenly were locked out of your account actually on March 17th if you had not turned this on. And basically, it was checking to make sure you had the most secure settings so that you would not lose your page. Good idea on some levels, or you lose access to your account and your page, everything else. But kind of a failed implementation because it locked many people out. They had to go through things. It wasn't working. I don't know. We'll have to see where this all goes. Meta was also busy with rolling out parental controls in Instagram. If you're not aware of that, this is happening in the United States, something that's going on there. And at South by Southwest, Mark Zuckerberg made noises about bringing NFTs coming into Instagram. You all perhaps have heard my opinion about this, but we'll have to see where this goes and what happens on what they actually do. Meanwhile, on something much more serious, the Justice Department in the United States rolled out guidelines, web accessibility guidelines under the Americans with Disabilities Act. For our listeners outside the U.S., the ADA is the law that basically indicates what businesses have to do to ensure that their information and content is available to Americans with disabilities and pieces like this. But there is something that communicators should be aware of, that there is now guidance on how state and local governments and businesses open to the public can make sure that their websites are as accessible to people with disabilities as required by the Americans with Disabilities Act. So an important thing to go and take a look at, understand these guidelines and what you need to do to ensure you are compliant if you're a U.S. business with the ADA and accessibility. Very important to go take a look at. Finally, I will just leave you with saying there's a really interesting transcript and also episode of the Decoder podcast on The Verge with Matt Mullenweg talking about how WordPress and Tumblr are keeping the internet weird. It's a really interesting interview with Matt Mullenweg, what his thinking is, what Automatic's vision is, how they are going and bringing together the various different pieces and parts that they have been putting together. So I'd highly encourage you to look at it. This is it's WordPress, of course, Tumblr, Day One, a number of other different apps, WooCommerce, different things like that. So a very good transcript and thing to listen to. And with that, I just want to conclude again by saying that I hope any of our listeners who may have been in the Ukraine are safe. I hope that all of this continues to a good resolution. And I also I hope any of our listeners in Russia are safe in the sense that if they're protesting, that's pretty bad these days for them. And with the sanctions, life's going to get pretty terrible, I think, in Russia for quite some time at this point. So best wishes to all of them. And I hope this war, this invasion ends soon. You can find more of my audio and writing at danyork.me. And thanks for listening, and back to you guys.
Well, this is a podcast about communication and public relations, so it makes sense to talk about public relations every now and then. We did that in one of our short episodes not too long ago. We talked about stories that are shared by sources on background and embargoes. That's a good old-fashioned PR story. Let's talk about another one. PR has an image problem. If you think about the PR professional as portrayed on TV shows or in movies, they are rarely bastions of conscience and ethical behavior. The treatment of the entertainment industry may be unfair, since most of those of us in the PR world do behave ethically and honestly, but there are enough cases of slimy behavior out there that grab headlines to give Hollywood some justification for those portrayals. The latest of these involves Ron Torossian, who until recently was CEO of 5WPR, a large PR agency in New York. Torossian is a highly visible CEO. He pals around with the likes of New York's new mayor, Eric Adams. He was writing op-eds, he was making speeches, and, like it or not, he was kind of a role model for the profession. So there's this website called Everything PR. It was started by a couple who sold it to Torossian back in 2014 for $2,500. And Torossian did not disclose that he bought it. For the last 8 years, he has been using this site to write glowing reviews of his agency and to slam competitors. He used fake bylines on the articles that he wrote. When he was accused of influencing the site by some of the competitors that were attacked, he denied it. until Crane's New York Business published an expose that was picked up by several others that made it pretty clear that he was behind this and he didn't have any choice. He had to admit everything. He issued an apology. It's an apology that he would have never made if, let's face it, he hadn't been caught. But getting caught led to a round of condemnations. PRSA New York's board of directors condemned Tarassian and 5WPR, calling his actions cowardly and a blatant violation of PRSA's code of ethics, and a stain on our profession that undermine our role as guardians of facts and integrity for those we serve. Richard Edelman, global CEO of Edelman, the world's largest independent PR agency, wrote a blistering blog post that got some coverage. He said he was stunned and nauseated by the revelation of Tarassian's misdeeds and called it simply unacceptable that 5WPR employees posed as journalists as part of the scheme. He wrote, "Our industry is still recovering from the dark arts campaign conducted by Bell Pottinger on behalf of a client seeking to undermine a sovereign state. Now we discover that one of our own in the industry has long been operating a website to savage competitors while touting its own work and clients." He called Tarassian's apology hollow and unbecoming, saying, "It is a mistaking of competitive zeal for contempt of truth. It is a perversion of media that takes advantage of the weakness of the system to issue disinformation worthy of the Kremlin. He engaged in disinformation and did it as a matter of competitive advantage." Now, all of this did lead Tarassian to step down as CEO, though he remains founder and chairman of the board. Among other things Tarassian did with the site was try to get publicity for clients who were under fire, like JetSmarter, whose president was arrested in 2017 on some grand theft-related charges with a previous employer. Another was Pornhub, the net's top pornography site, which had been sued for allegedly profiting from the exploitation of underage victims and a few other things. But on everything PR, all you'd find was positive praise for both companies. But lest you think Tarassian is an outlier, PR News wants you to remember aviation company Blade, which used a fake spokesperson for several years. Its director of communication, Simon McLaren, was completely fabricated. Company leaders issued press statements in his name and even impersonated this guy in phone interviews. Now, the question I keep coming back to every time something like this happens, and it's been happening for as long as we've been recording this show, is how do we establish accountability in the industry? Now, PR News Online points out that the industry has struggled with this question for decades. They've looked at licensing and censure and disbarment, and none of it has led anywhere. We have talked about associations and code of ethics, but when's the last time you heard about someone being stripped of their membership because of an ethics violation? And what about all those PR practitioners who don't even belong to an association? Never forget that all it takes to call yourself a PR professional is to call yourself a PR professional. Writing for PR News Online, Robert Hastings says the answer is to follow the money. Every ethical misdeed, he says, was fueled by profit. He writes, the call to action for business to partner with PR professional associations and demand ethical behavior from all of their PR partners. After all, don't the businesses that hire these outliers share in the responsibility for their ethical transgressions? Businesses must recognize that PR representatives' bad behavior is also their bad behavior. Business leaders must work with PR partners and practitioners who subscribe to one of the industry's code of ethics. It is only when the money ceases to reward bad behavior that bad behavior ceases. All right, that sounds okay at first, but some of the companies are probably delighted when their PR agency gets them good press, regardless of the sleazy tactics that they employ. Others don't have the mechanisms in place to pursue these kinds of actions. Can they really vet the PR agency and determine what they've done? Can they figure out that what they've done really violated a code of ethics when they don't pay attention to PR codes of ethics? I don't know how you bring all business together to establish a consistent and common vetting process on the ethics of the PR people they hire. I still lean towards some kind of certification that you must have in order to practice PR, just like an accountant, a doctor, a lawyer, even a wastewater engineer needs to have a certificate in order to do their work for somebody else. And if they violate the rules, that certification is withdrawn and they can't work. But I'd love to hear what listeners think. There has to be a solution to this. What about you, Neville? What do you think the solution to this is?
Well, the first thought in my mind was, because I don't see it in any of the articles that I've been looking at for this, is, if he was a member of a professional body, has he been expelled?
I don't know if PRSA, I know he's a member.
Right.
I don't know if he's been expelled. If he has, they have not made a public statement about it that I have seen.
So
my guess is no.
If that hasn't happened,
my
then
guess is the last person that was expelled from PRSA was Tony Franco, and that goes back, 16, 17 years?
In which case, there's not a hope in hell of anything happening as a result of this, because that makes a mockery of all the criticisms in that case. And the fact that, I'm sorry, PRSA, I think you do a great job. But if you said you censured him or whatever the words are, I mean, come on, for Christ's sake, fire the guy, revoke his membership. Everyone is saying it's unethical. He's egregious breach of ethics behavior, and he's still a member. So it reminds me a bit of the AVE, advertising value equivalency, that some people still think is a great thing. Here in the UK, the CIPR, if you do that, you can lose your membership of the CIPR. And that has happened, I have heard anecdotally. I don't know names or more than that. So to address it, you've got to have the teeth already in place. And a bite has to be taken to, in a sense, to, like the cops say, to deter others. Make an example of this guy, and you come down very heavy. But I'm looking at the article in Provoke Media, and the photograph of Ron Tarossia, looking at his face, he's a nice-looking guy, but he's smiling. He's probably thinking, "You jerks! I bet you he is. So, I've heard of him, and we've talked about him in the past too on FIR.
Yeah, usually based on misbehavior.
Right, always actually, Shell. It's always something controversial. But I would say that he doesn't deserve the right to belong to a professional body that is all about upholding ethics in public relations practice and behaviors.
I think that's fine, but it being bounced out of the association doesn't prevent him from doing the same kind of work on behalf of other clients.
Unless you've got a licensed methodology you spoke about, that you've got to have some kind of professional recognition to practice the profession. Until that happens, then that doesn't matter.
Well, what do you need? A blacklist? Can we send out a list of unethical PR people to businesses?
That's up to individuals. They want to do that. But I think you shouldn't give this guy the benefit of the allure, the kind of glow of being part of a professional body that upholds ethical behavior when he clearly can't do that. So how can he be a member? Don't you have to? You do actually reaffirm every time you renew your membership. You've got to reaffirm that you uphold the standards here's a code of conduct. Yes, I abide by this. That has ethics front and center in that. How can he, with a straight face, because he doesn't have one here, how can he answer that question? Yes. No, nothing will happen as a result of this show. The hand wringings happened. The criticisms happened. The cries of how awful this is. Nothing more will happen.
Well, I hope that we can figure something out, because this has been going on too long, and
agreed.
It does lead to a general public perception of the industry that is out of whack with the reality that most people do behave in an ethical manner in the practice of public relations on behalf of their employers and clients.
I agree with you. Most people do. And I think that, this is a kind of rabbit hole part of the discussion, really. We could go down, but I don't want to do that. But I think, like in every profession, there are bad eggs. And this man seems to be a pretty bad egg. In which case, he may be able to get you the column inches or whatever it is you want, but the means don't justify the end, although he thinks they do, I suppose.
I think the problem is that there are bad eggs in, say, the medical profession.
Every profession.
But that doesn't lead to the medical profession being painted as an unethical profession. That's happening in PR. Okay. And that's why I think we need to find a way to deal with this. And maybe it's burnishing the image. Maybe it's promoting the fact that most of us do behave ethically. And I mean, I don't want to suggest a campaign because that's short term. But we need to do something to create this organic movement that shows that there are bad eggs, but mostly this is a very ethical profession doing honest and ethical work.
Yeah, not sure how that would work in terms of convincing anyone who doesn't seem to have a very high impression of.
Yeah, maybe we'd just lobby Hollywood. That's all.
That would do. That might gain some traction there, Shell. It might. I mean, it's a bit like if you've seen the film "Thank You for Smoking." We should produce something like that. I think. I mean, maybe I don't know, but it is worrying. I mean, just being serious about this. I think the statement. I'm again looking at Provoke Media's piece. The headline: Ron Taros admits to quote ethical lapses unquote. Like that's not really real amid news site controversy. No, I mean that's not good enough. Not really. He's got away with this. It seems to me with a smacked wrist. He's sorry about the missteps, errors in judgment during the 20-year history of his firm. For God's sake, this is going on 2 decades in total. And what's his penalty? Zip, 0. Apology, smack on the wrist. That's it. And you're right. There's no licensing. There's no regulation, if you like. So he carries on.
I want him to be banned from being able to practice public relations ever again. And
yeah,
I don't know how we get to that, but.
Not in our lifetime, Shell. That's what I would say. So on that note, I agree with you. I'd love to know what anyone listening to this podcast who's in this profession or even who's not in this profession has a view on this, because I think the more people who can articulate an opinion on this, I think the more chances that it'll get traction and picked up and maybe something might happen. I'm not going to say someone should do something about this because we could do something. So we're having this conversation. And are we issuing like a call to action to the professional bodies? Hey guys, step up, take a lead. Is that what should happen? Maybe. It's a start point, isn't it?
Well, there is the Global Alliance, which is an organization of which PR associations are a member. Yep. Maybe it's something they tackle. Maybe it's the next Melbourne mandate coming out of the Global Alliance.
Okay, there's a call. Guys, love to hear from you. So what do we got next? Yes, Accenture. That's our next story. This Accenture, the consulting firm, came out a few days ago with technology vision, as VentureBeat describes it. This is where I saw the story. That is called Meet Me in the Metaverse. And they list the top 4 tech trends for 2022 that Accenture believes are critical for enterprises to pay attention to. When I read the piece on their website, the description of this, I thought, yeah, okay, I wouldn't call it for 2022. To me, it's more like for the 2020s. Starting in 2022. So maybe for the next 5 to 8 years, this is what is going to evolve. 4 trends that Accenture says are redefining the intersection between people and technology. And okay, fine. Well, what are these things? The first one's called WebMe, one word, capital W, capital N, one word. This looks at how the internet is being reimagined. And that's actually a pretty good way of describing it, I think. Accenture says the last 2 years have spurred enterprises to explore new modes of digital experience and pushed people to live virtually to an extent they never expected. Now the metaverse is emerging, reconciling how the internet is designed with what we will demand from it going forward. There's many arguments about that phrase, frankly, and now that the metaverse is emerging. Depends on your perspective. And I'm kind of quoting Accenture from their perspective as a firm that deals with the largest enterprises in the world, basically, the ones that are very global. And so it's from that perspective, the metaverse emerging. This is not about Mark Zuckerberg's vision of what Meta's going to convert into, where everyone can go and party and do all this kind of stuff, although it is also part of that. It's also part of the reality that no one is clear yet on what the metaverse is. And there's lots of people doing things where they use the word metaverse. In the meantime, you've got people like Accenture. You've got Deloitte, who we talked about, if I recall, Shell, 2-3 months ago, maybe with something, well, I won't call it similar, but again, something about the evolution, Web3, all that's connected. So the metaverse is emerging. how it's designed with what we will demand from it going forward, they say. But the value of new virtual worlds would be capped if not for parallel changes that anchor them in the physical one. The second trend, called programmable world, tracks how technology exists in our physical environments in increasingly sophisticated ways. It projects how the convergence of new technologies like 5G are changing the way businesses interact with the physical world. We'll soon be able to unlock an unprecedented level of control, automation, and personalization, says Accenture. In the third trend, they're exploring the emergence of the unreal, capital T, capital U, a trend where our environments are increasingly filled with machines that are passably human. Unreal, quote unquote, qualities are becoming intrinsic to the AI, they say, and even the data that enterprises are using. But bad actors are using it too, from deepfakes to bots and more. Like it or not, says Accenture, enterprises have been thrust into the forefront of a world questioning what's real, what isn't, and if the line between those two really matters. Finally, Accenture believes we will reset the boundaries of traditional industries as we begin computing the impossible, capital C, capital I. The outer limit of what is computationally possible is being disrupted as a new class of machines emerges. Quantum, biologically inspired, and high-performance computers are each allowing companies to tackle the biggest challenges in their industries. So just like in the early years of the web, businesses are racing towards a future utterly different from the one they were designed for. Over the next decade, Accenture says, we'll witness a complete transformation of nearly every environment in which companies do business. Hence my thinking that this is more about trends for the 2020s. 4, there's probably lots more, but these seem to me to be feasible, quite credible, very top level look on a landscape that is highly relevant to large enterprises, particularly those with multiple operations globally. Not necessarily in tech. I'm thinking of automotive. I'm thinking of chemicals, heavy industry of all types, retail. I mean, every industry you can possibly think of. And I'm also connecting it in my mind to what's happening right now with sanctions on Russia, where the global balance is shifting because of these sanctions. And we're seeing a lot of talk recently emerging about the so-called splinternet, where Russia will become disconnected from the global internet. I see lots of talk about that, about 50-50 on whether that's even possible to do or not, given the decentralized nature of the internet. But that plays into this indeed. So if we find a significant economy, and Russia still is, that won't be participating in this because of what's happening now, this shift that's taking place, what impact would it have on this, I wonder? But I do think Accenture's publicly posted literally a thought book, not a playbook so much, of this is where things could be going. This is what we see is what enterprises need to pay attention to, and this is what we're currently doing. It's worth attention, I think, Sean.
Oh, yeah, I have no issue with any of those 4. I think that the general public is going to see some of them more visibly than others. WebMe, is that what that first one was called?
Yeah, WebMe.
WebMe. Clearly a good new label, since Web3 is all about elevating the creator and putting the power back in the hand of the individual and shifting it away from these centralized corporations like Meta and Google and Amazon. The one that I was focused on as you were talking, though, was the programmable future. That's just because of an experience this morning, talking to Michelle before we started to record. She said, wow, it was really cold in the house last night. And I said, you should have woken me up. I would have gone upstairs and kicked the heat on. And I just immediately thought, yeah, it's time to get a smart thermostat, because then all I would have had to do was turn to, what's her name? Madam A. I can't say anything because she's right there and will respond.
Yeah.
And said, turn the thermostat on to 68 degrees, right? And that's all it would have taken. She could have done it all by herself without waking me at all. So, this is going to be much more common, where we're able to program stuff that used to require some sort of a manual activity. So we're going to see that accelerate in ways that we can't even imagine, and it's going to happen really fast. I
agree. And indeed, that's a very good example you mentioned, because we've got half the bits and pieces. I mean, like you, I've got what I call it Jane. That's my name for Miss G, actually, Jane with a J. So I called it Jane. And so I've got devices all over the house that I can speak to at any moment. And indeed, the devices can do amazing things, but I don't have that bit of tech to do the stuff. So I don't have a smart thermostat. I got Wi-Fi light bulbs everywhere. They're really
Me too.
Cool. They're really great fun. So
I also have a smart doorbell.
No, I didn't get one of those because we don't get visitors really, other than the courier deliveries, and so I'm not too bothered about that. But the thermostat one is great, and I saw a product just the other day. So this shows you how things are evolving in a small area like that. Until recently, when I last looked about a year ago, the only ones you could find that were credible offerings, not some no-name brand out of the Far East somewhere, required someone specialist to install it, needs to be wired in, all this kind of. Now I see them that are not. You literally stick them on the wall and Wi-Fi communicates. But you need a little gizmo that you fit on your central heating system. And there's now one out that according to what the manufacturer says, is compatible with every heating system on sale in the UK right now. So, I often think to myself, I bet I've got the one that isn't, But this is a small example of where this is going. And this piece from Accenture, they talk about new technology like 5G. Actually, I think new is more 6G now because I see people talk about 6G. But 5G's rolled out. Here in the UK, it's everywhere. I get 5G all the time here. So change it faster, change the way businesses interact with the physical world. Yeah, things like that are the enablers. And so that's just one small example you've mentioned.
And the Internet of Things is going to play a part here.
I don't know
my organization
anyone calling it that anymore, actually, but yeah, it will play a part.
Yeah, as you know, I work for a construction company, and we have two structures that are going up right now where we're partnering with a high-tech organization called Join and adding their features to the infrastructure of the building. And the idea here is to be part of smart cities. So you're able to monitor things like how many people open the door and walk in, how many people take an elevator ride, how far, and not only get that data for your building, but the city can roll all that up to find out which ones are using more energy and which ones are using less, so they can figure out how to balance loads and the like. I think this programmable future is something we're going to see kick into high gear in short order.
Yeah, I wonder about the one they talk about on the Unreal, the trend where our environments are increasingly filled with machines that are passably human. They talk about that. Unreal qualities becoming intrinsic to the AI, including the data that enterprises use. So
there are artificial influencers out there. We've talked about that on the show before. So this takes it to. We've also talked about legitimate uses of deepfakes. Your CEO can speak to an audience in another country in their native language, even though he doesn't speak a word of that language, as long as he's behind it and saying, yeah, these are my words. They've been appropriately translated, and I want people to hear me saying it. As long as the audience knows that that's what's happened, it still matters to look in his eyes while he's speaking these words that he did speak in his native language. So legitimate uses of deepfakes, and we're going to see a lot of that.
We will. It's an interesting time. So good stuff. So worth paying attention to.
Yeah, one quick last story to talk about, and that's dealing with social audio, which is getting to be a pretty big deal. Yeah, I got a notification I think it was day before yesterday, that our friend Jeremiah Aoyang was in Twitter Spaces talking about crypto voxels. This is a virtual world, a metaverse world, built on blockchain, really easy to use with processes that will remind you of Minecraft. That's what makes it easy to use. I also jumped into a Twitter Spaces conversation that Tom Webster was having, he of Edison Research. I don't plan to listen to these, but when I see in my feed that they're happening, and if I'm interested, I jump in and listen. Sometimes I just keep listening while I keep on doing my work. But a lot of people plan to be in Twitter Spaces or one of the other social audio platforms for regularly scheduled programming. It's a space that really is growing fast. Another space that grew fast got started back in 2015, and that was streaming video. Obviously, it had been around longer, but it really kind of kicked in as part of the social sphere with a tool called Meerkat that it had made its debut in February of 2015. It really took off at South by Southwest, as so many popular apps like this do. And then Twitter jumped into the game, followed by virtually every other mainstream social app on the planet. And Meerkat died. It was shut down in October of 2016. And that's what seems to be happening to Clubhouse. Clubhouse is the app that kicked off this whole social audio trend. Popular Clubhouse hosts are pulling their shows and taking them elsewhere. There's one called Lullaby Club. It had nearly 70,000 members and even had a profile done in the New York Times. But its host, Axel Mansour, announced that he's moving to a new social audio app that has just been launched by Amazon. Clubhouse, according to an article in Wired magazine, just hasn't been able to handle its own hype. It grew too fast. It wasn't prepared for the sudden crowds. Junky rooms full of stuff like multi-level marketing schemes dominated, and competitors took advantage of all of this by coming up with better managed tools. Now, Clubhouse's leaders think that they're going to be able to rebound, that its current state is allowing them to build a more sustainable infrastructure for the long term. But considering it was once valued at $4 billion, it now has fewer than 100 employees. And even though they're giving it the old college try, consider that during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, even though there were a lot of Clubhouse rooms exploring the implications of the invasion, even with expert speakers, where were people going? They were going where they hadn't been looking for it, where they were seeing that they were being done on Twitter Spaces because it crossed their Twitter feeds, right? And these attracted thousands of participants. The author of this article in Wired said that he was already in Twitter. It was only one click away. And that's where he went to participate in these social audio conversations. That's what Clubhouse is up against. Now, it isn't the only independent social app out there. There's Beams and Pluto and Racket and Quest, for example. But I don't think any of them are going to capture the audience that Twitter, Meta, Amazon, and the bigger, consolidated platforms are going to be able to capture as an add-on service to appeal to the audiences that they already have. But this doesn't mean that social audio isn't worth your time. It definitely is. You just have to accept that for now, it's going to be the province of the big online services.
Yeah, that sounds a plausible avenue. Like you, I listened to quite a few Twitter Spaces sessions, but there's maybe 2 or 3 that I'll look out for, but they're all casual. And there's even a few that I listen to which are enjoyable, they're like background, like a radio.
Yeah.
But it's evolved beautifully to me. And I'm in Twitter all the time, so it's a natural thing for me. It's either on my phone or more typically at my desk in the office. So I'm actually not surprised at all about Clubhouse. I've actually not been to Clubhouse this year. And before that, it was like 3 times only. I've never really taken to Clubhouse.
Yeah, my phone keeps dinging to tell me that there's something interesting on Clubhouse, and I ignore it.
Yeah, I uninstalled the app, in fact, I think in November or December last year. But Twitter Spaces, though, is good. So it's interesting what you said. This is like the life cycle evolution that it repeats itself, isn't it? An early trailblazer, like a fiery comet up there, and it gets all the attention, and suddenly is in decline. And competitors arrive or had arrived. They tuned in their offering, sensed the mood of the crowd that shifts, and were there for people. So they've all moved to the new one. How fickle we are, right? But hey, that's how it works, isn't it? So
that's right. Lack of friction, ease of access. Quality of content, and that's something Clubhouse really struggled with. There was a lot of crap
going
on.
I heard that a lot from people.
Yeah.
So we'll wait for the next best thing since sliced bread to come along.
We will, and if it comes up in the next month, we'll probably talk about it in the next monthly report of the Hobson and Holtz report, which will be dropped on Monday, April 18th. We'll record that on Saturday, the 16th, but definitely keep an eye out for our short episodes. We'll probably have one up by Tuesday or Wednesday. Those will continue to come.
We're doing about 2 a week. That's what it's.
We're managing to do 2 a week. We originally said we'll do 1 or 2, and we haven't had a week where we only did 1. So we'll probably continue to do 2. And we do want to hear from you about what you think about anything that we have talked about today. What can we do to stop the Ron Tarossians of the PR world? Let us know what you think about that. Anything else we've talked about, anything we talk about in our short form episodes, send email to fircomments@gmail.com. Attach up to a 3-minute audio file, and we can play that. You can record that audio directly from the FIR website. There's a send voicemail tab on the right-hand side. Click it, and you can record up to 90 seconds. If what you have to say takes more than 90 seconds, record 2 of them. I know how to edit those into one file, believe it or not. Leave a comment directly on the show notes for this episode at firpodcastnetwork.com, or share your thoughts on the FIR community on Facebook. And